Okay. So we're going to continue what we started with. We're going to do Shabbos elevators, the Shabbos elevator part 2. Okay, so as follows. Last week I think we ended off Pachas Yaiser at the machlokes between the two sides in how to look at a Shabbos elevator, to be mekel, to not be mekel. We spoke about Shlomo Zalman's school of thought and the people who followed him. We spoke about the Bnei Brak school of thought, Rav Vosner and Nissen Karelitz, etc. And I want to A, peel back a layer, and B, maybe show us a little bit of precedent for some of the things. So just before we start, Shlomo Zalman, we spoke last week, put out a sefer called Ma'irei Eish. He put it out when he was very, very young, and it had all the inyan of electricity and some groundbreaking stuff. Now, in 2009, somebody put out a sefer called Ma'irei Eish HaShalom. It looks like the rest of Shlomo Zalman's Svarim. It's published by the same Mechon that published Shlomo Zalman's Svarim. But if you look inside the cover, you'll see that it's okay. We'll see what it says. But really, the publisher is someone, Rav Zalman Menachem Koren. He's the one who put out the sefer, and what he did was basically he collected every article and every shtickle Torah that Shlomo Zalman wrote throughout the years about electricity. And Shlomo Zalman contributed to many kontresim and many kisveyes and etc. Together with Shlomo Zalman's notes at home on electricity, and he put it together into a brand new sefer called Ma'irei Eish HaShalom. That was 3 volumes. It was like 3 times as long as the original Ma'irei Eish, and in it he added some additional footnotes and reworking and ha'aris, v'hagoyis. He did a lot more work in it than just putting up Shlomo Zalman's Torah. And in there, in 2009, which is significantly after Shlomo Zalman was nifter already, he revisits the Shabbos elevator, and of course brings Shlomo Zalman's Torah, and he's making on Shabbos elevators. Now this printing of Ma'irei Eish HaShalom stirred up a bit of controversy. When it came out, so in different chevereses of the time, people wrote protests. So I printed out one to read from a little bit, where someone writes bikoret on the sefer. He says, I felt like I have to protest. He says, because I found a sefer called Ma'irei Eish HaShalom from Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, and he says, Achein, the sefer was put out in Tafshin Ayin, which is 2010. Sefer Ma'irei Eish HaShalom. It says Merechas Eitz Shlomo. It says about Krichas HaSefer, on the binding of the sefer, Rashim Shama Mechaber Moran HaGrishaz Auerbach Zatzal. It says the Mechaber is of Shlomo Zalman. B'chein B'fnim HaSefer. It says Me'ez Harav Again of Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. It says, and imagine my surprise, imagine my surprise, I opened it up, and I see that it's got all sorts of things that aren't from Shlomo Zalman in there. And that he's by far not the only mechaber of said sefer. He says it's true, it's true that Shlomo Zalman once upon a time published a sefer called Ma'irei Eish, B'tzirasei Mamash, when he was very young. Aval as a sefer Ma'irei Eish HaShalom, Me'elim lechiber. Shlomo Zalman never put out a sefer called Ma'irei Eish HaShalom. It doesn't exist. It's not his sefer. Eluhulikut mikam mekayres ma'amarim. Says etc. etc. And he says imagine. He says hine nitar latzmeinu. Imagine. How would it seem? Someone would come out in 2010 and publish a sefer called Chazanish HaShalom. Meis Rabbeinu Avram Yishai Karelitz Zatzal. Ubayim look at them sefer gam teisefes shel Shmuas. There's different quotes. Sheshama plaini mi plaini. So and so or so and so. That the Chazanish said such and such. B'shmoi v'chein teisefes parshanot u'psakim shel Eizer Talmud Chacham. Says in explanations and biurim from the Talmud Chacham underneath. Says imagine if I'd published a sefer like that. He said you'd throw me out of his medrash. He says, that's not a sefer for Shlomo Zalman. How and why is this sefer walking around masquerading like Shlomo Zalman's sefer? Then he moves on after the general, full frontal attack, and he says, in Befrat, there are several psakim in there that are clearly not ois gehalten b'mishnas of Shlomo Zalman. And obviously, number 1, ois aleph is malit Shabbat. The elevator of Shabbos, he says, that is brought down in the sefer is clearly not ois gehalten al pir Shlomo Zalman's Teiris. He says, over here in this sefer, and this part I'll leave for a second, they rely on a specific set of heterim that Shlomo Zalman was saying on. And he says, I know, I spoke to Shmuel Auerbach, and it's brought down in other svarim, that Shmuel Auerbach said that the elevator that his father was talking about was a mechanical elevator, which was much more simple and easy to be makel with this method, but the sophisticated computerized elevators of today, my father would never have held like this about, is what Shmuel Auerbach told him. He says, and striking to see, the one psak, the one collected shmua that's neglected to be brought down in the sefer is this one from Shmuel Auerbach. It says it's quoted in other svarim who collect, different things from Paiskim. This sefer neglects to bring it. But now, So in the rebuttal, the mechaber of the sefer, the next article in this country is from the mechaber of the sefer who rebuts it and says that he was very getrai to Shlomo Zalman and he chas v'shalom didn't take anything. He wasn't moisif and megareya, anything that Shlomo Zalman said or didn't say. We only collected it, and only upon hearing from different people that certain things needed to be explained a little better because your average person couldn't understand what Shlomo Zalman was talking about in his shorthand, home notes that he was writing for himself. So I added them, and it's in italics. You could tell what's mine and what's his, and then he defends the position of elevators, etc., etc. But this fight over the Ma'ariya Shashalim was in the shadow of that ban, that psak that we read from last week that was put out in Bnei Brak. In the shadow of that psak that came out that said that it's unacceptable and that all the Gedalim signed on that it shouldn't be allowed, so there was this machlekes about putting out the sefer or not. Now, let's just go back a step. We didn't talk about this last week, and I thought it's important to just figure out what exactly the basic halacha part of the machlekes is between Shlomo Zalman and the other poskim. So now, there's a din. The Gemara in Shabbos in Daf Kofchaf says that if you have a candle that's open in a room near a door, you're not allowed to open the door in front of the candle because we're afraid the candle is going to go out. Now the Gemara brings a machlekes. The Gemara says as follows. The Gemara says like this: Layet ala tano ner shacheri adelas, a candle that's behind the door. Poiseach v'noyel kedarka. You're allowed to open and close the door as you were. V'im kafsa kafsa. If it goes out, it goes out. Not your problem. Layet ala Rav. Rav used to curse the person who did this. Amalei Ravina l'Ravacha. The Rav says because you hold like Rav Yehuda, you curse anybody who holds like Rav Shimon. Meaning it's a well-known machlekes. If Eina Mischaven is aser or mutter. So the Mandamur says that you're allowed to open the door and you don't have to worry about it. Holds Eina Mischaven as mutter. It's not a problem. You hold Eina Mischaven as aser, so you hold it's aser. But because you hold Eina Mischaven as aser, you hold anybody else who says differently as mamish mufrach. It's a well-standing machlekes. So to which the Gemara responds, and this is a famous yisoid, no, b'zeh afilu Rav Shimon's moida. Why? Because psik reisha v'layamas. Rav Shimon's moida that if something's a psik reisha, something it's automatic, it's inherent. That from the action you do, the consequence will be a malacha. Then it doesn't matter if you're mechaven, you're not mechaven. Even Rav Shimon is maskim that it's called the malacha Shabbos and you're asa. And this is you say this famous Gemara, which becomes very relevant to something like elevators or electricity or any circuit that you're closing. Meaning, in theory, you could look at it. When I walk past an electric circuit and I trigger the electric circuit and therefore something happens, I made a mischaven. I didn't touch anything. I didn't look at anything. I didn't do anything. I had no intention to interact, to close a circuit, to create an electrical response. But Hayos, the Gemara says that anything that's a psik reisha, even Reb Shimon is maskim, is aser. So the din is kipshuta that al kapanim v'derabbanon, even if you don't have intention to do something, but if your action is clearly going to lead to the consequence in a direct manner, then it's aser anyhow. Now, the Gemara later on in Kufchaf brings another concept. The Gemara says as follows. The Darshans are from a pasuk. It says as follows: Loisase kol malacha asiyahu da aser grama shari. The Gemara brings this in regard to a different din, but it's also another very primary relevant din to Hilchos Shabbos, is that the Gemara says, L'sasik malacha, the pasuk says you're not allowed to do any malacha on Shabbos. Asiyahu da'asar, a grama is shari. If you're only doing a grama, you're only causing a malacha to happen, that's allowed on Shabbos. So, this is what the Gemara says. Now, there's another Gemara about grama that just makes it a little more complicated, and that the Gemara in the end of the third parak of Shabbos, in the end of Kira, the Gemara brings another machlekes about when grama is permitted and when grama is not permitted. The Gemara brings as follows. I'm not going to read this Gemara, but the Gemara brings, the Handlerai over there is about putting a cup full of water near a candle to catch the sparks. You have a candle that's throwing off some sparks, and you don't want it to catch on fire. So you're allowed to put a glass of water or just a plain plate around it. It's a mukta shayla, it's putting out a kivoy, mechave shayla, putting it out. And the Gemara brings possibly a machlekes if grama b'Shabbos is us or not. Now there's a big machlekes Rishayim, and it's very unclear to learn how to shtim these two Gemaras. Like, do we actually hold grama as mutter always? Is grama only mutter sometimes? Are there different kinds of grama? So it's a complicated nidin in the Gemara and the Rishayim, and lahalacha, and the Mechaber Lamashal Paskins seems very clear. In Shin Lamedala, the Mechaber Paskins, that grama b'Shabbos is mutter. To which the Ramah says, Haga b'makom pseida. If it's a hefsid, you could be saying like grama's mutter. On him, the Taz comes and says, the Ramah is being machmer like a day yichida. It's really one day in the Mordechai, even if it's not such a pseida. Comes along other poskim, say no, the Ramah is not a day yichida. There's really a shilta gibarim that holds like that. So it's like a complicated layered machlekes exactly when and how much we could be Seimech on Shabbos Mishum Grama. But I just wanted to lay the groundwork. There's two Gemaras. There's kind of a stira. There seems to be different man the Amrim. There's Machlekes Rishonim. It's Machlekes in the Shulchan Aruch. But Al Kapanim does seem to be a din that Al Kapanim Deraisa Grama's mutter. Now, on this is what the core heter of Reb Shlomo Zalman is based for the elevators. Reb Shlomo Zalman has a famous tshuva in Mincha Shleima, in his sefer Mincha Shleima Chelik Aleph, tshuva Yud Aleph. He has tshuva Yud. He has a shaila about opening refrigerators on Shabbos, opening ovens, refrigerators. I think everyone's by contact the shaila. It's a famous shaila. Reb Shlomo Zalman has some groundbreaking work. He's the first one to say that even when the refrigerator is off, the engine is not on, and by opening it, you're going to cause the engine to go on to cool the refrigerator. Still, you're allowed to open the refrigerator. And he has a long arichas, many anafim to be makel in anaf vav, in ois vav. He even has a way how the Chazon Ish, who holds electricity, is deraisa could be makel, etc. But a lot of what Rosh Zalman is basing his heterim for these electricity things are, and what was incorporated in the Shabbos elevators to try to fix the problem, was to create a matziv of grama, to create a situation where your direct activity doesn't lead to an outcome that's chilul Shabbos. There's always an element of a step removed, meaning you're going to do something, it's going to close the circuit, and then in a randomized amount of time, something will go on. Rosh Zalman always looked to create one step away, like a step of grama, in order to be more makel in these Hilchos Shabbos house. Now, if you read from Tzomet, from the Mechon, so they have big arichasin in their Svarim to explain from a technical standpoint how they incorporated grama into the elevators and how they made everything grama, etc. That was the core premise of Rosh Zalman's workaround over here. Now, in the Ma'irei Shashalim, the things that he brings is as follows. He brings a few interesting anecdotal stories from Rosh Zalman about the elevator. He says when the elevators came out and a Shabbos elevator became an option, Rosh Zalman told his son, Rabbi Avram Doiv, that it's incumbent on us to be mesader, figure out exactly the way to make a Shabbos elevator and be mefarsim the heter. He says, why? Because your average person who's not too frum is not going to not take an elevator on Shabbos. He's going to take an elevator on Shabbos. And if in his mind, by taking an elevator on Shabbos, he's being mechal Shabbos, so okay, so then I lost it already. And then I could be making like a cut a corner here. I'm savvy say not Hashem Shabbos, meaning someone who lives on a high floor and is not going to be able to be Nisayan. He's going to say, listen, there's rabbis who say it's okay, I'm good. And then he hears that, no, it's Chilul Shabbos Deiraisa. So, okay, fine, so I'm out. I'm not, that's like a guy who ate on a fast. All right, I start fasting again, it's over, I'm done. So Meli says, Rav Zalman said, it's very important that we come up with if there's a potential to be makel, we have to figure it out and be mefarsim. He says, a personal story of Rav Zalman was once in the hospital in 1963, in Hadassah Hospital, after having a surgery, Parshas Zachar. Rav Zalman wanted to go here, Parshas Zachar, which is the Deraisa, according to some Rishonim. And Rav Zalman and his son, who was of able body, who didn't just have a surgery, used the Shabbos elevator to go down and to go up in Hadassah Hospital. Like a personal anecdote. And he has over here, an Einikal asked Rav Zalman, he asked Rav Zalman, okay, good, I hear you had there, I hear the whole cheshbon. Und was mit the gefiel? What's with the gefiel? It just doesn't feel right to go on Shabbos elevators on Shabbos. Rav Zalman told him, I answered you mitzad shuras hadin. Gefiel, I can't pass it on. There's no hira kavua on gefiel. I can't tell you like a psak. You have to gefiel like this. You have to gefiel like that. I can't explain that to you. Etc. etc. He brings many of these like anecdotal stories, which is what triggered the bikoret. It's what triggered the people against the sefer. They're like, this is not a sefer. This is not a serious psak. You're bringing me a maisi word from him. He said like, it's not. This is not the. Then in the next volume, after the critique came in, so he brings what Rav Shlomo Zalman wrote in the Sefer Shmir Shabbos Kilchasa to explain his heter for elevators, and it's a little bit cryptic, and I'll read it for you quickly just to say what it is, and then we'll move on. But or I won't. I can't find the exact quote. But Rav Shlomo Zalman over there, basically says that it's not a given that you're going to be causing a malacha to happen, and even if your weight is causing the electricity to increase, it's possible that at the same time in the mechanism something else let up, so it balances and you're not actually causing any more electricity to be brought into the system. It's not a psik reisha, and then Rav Zalman says even if it's more likely that you are actually causing something, but it's only with grama, Rav Zalman is noita with grama to be makel. Now ad kedei kach that in one of these letters that I have, I can't find it now, after the psak came out from the poskim in Bnei Brak to be against Shabbos elevators, so there was a meeting in Rabbi Efrati's house, Moshe Mordechai Karp and Rabbi Yosef Efrati, and I forgot there was like a few more Talmidim, people who were close to Shlomo Zalman, and Rabbi Yitzchak Halpern, and they sat down to be done. Okay, gerecht, we know now that a lot of the Gedolei HaPoskim say that it's Aser B'Hachlat, and you're not allowed to do it, either Mishum Avdin D'Chol, or Zilus of the Shabbata, or even Medina. We understand that. But what? Rosh Zalman's not here to respond. I think someone asked this last week. Rosh Zalman's not here to respond. What would Rosh Zalman hold? And they sat down, and at the meeting they decided that Rosh Zalman would still hold of his heter, based on how they understood Rosh Zalman's heter, and how they understood what the updated mechanics and what the updated technical situation was. Rosh Zalman would still hold of his heter, is what these poskim, these young poskim at that point decided at that meeting. Now, b'chol eifin, after all the halacha parts, so there's the zilus of the Shabbat part, right? There's the part of zilus of the Shabbat that it's not Shabbosdik. It's not Shabbosdik. It doesn't feel Shabbosdik. So I wanted to go into that Indian a little bit and show a little bit of some of the other times, relatively recently that came up. So now in the I guess late 1700s, early 1800s, trains and trolleys and light rail became a thing in the big urban areas in Europe, in the cities in Europe. And it was negeya to start traveling around a little bit, so that if there was a chazan who would be in the shul in Vienna on the other side of town, and you live over here, it could be negeya to go hear the chazan. If you just hop on a train, you buy a ticket before Shabbos, and there's an Erev, let's say, and it's not out of the tchum because there's enough houses near each other, and you just get on the train, you show the conductor your ticket, and invite the gang, and you get off by shul. Would that be permitted, or would that be not permitted? Now, the first one to answer the shayla, to be asked the shayla, to answer the shayla, is the Chasam Sofer. Now, the Chasam Sofer has a very difficult time answering it. Sofer goes through Tchumen, he goes through Muktzah, he goes through, anything that should be relevant to Asr it. He goes through, he shows you're allowed to travel on a boat on Shabbos, provided that you're not going to do any actual malacha, etc. So he has a very hard time answering it. To the end, he ends off with something very interesting. He ends off saying as follows. He says, there's a din, and this is very zilus of the Shabbat. He says as follows. He says there's a difference between traveling on a boat on Shabbos and traveling on a train. He says, Tzarech leimar, the shani yeshiva svina. When you sit in a boat on Shabbos, you're traveling on a steamship on Shabbos. The yoshev v'shevis k'mei b'chedem mitasa b'beisei. You're sitting in your cabin. It's like your home in your house. You're not doing anything. You're sitting. You're having Shabbos in your cabin. The water is bringing you to where it brings you to. You're relaxing. Which is a train in whatever. You're not resting. You're bouncing around from here to there. Obviously, a primitive coal-powered train was not a pleasant trip. It was crazy to be chalam that you could travel at 40 miles an hour across town, but it was far from comfortable. Assume that you're not going to be able to make on the train. You're not going to be able to sit and fear Shabbos on the train. All you're doing is accomplishing your travel time on Shabbos. You're getting to where you need to go to on Shabbos. So he says, Pashat the Gar Har B'Tei Mimach Shechal Chum V'Isr Gamaru, and according to the Ramban, he says it would even be in Issa Raisa, and says it's certainly included in the pasuk of Mtashiv Mishavas Raglecha Asayis Chaftzcha B'Yem Kachi V'Karasel Shabbos Eineg V'Chibadeta Me'asayis Terachachem Imsei Chaftzcha V'Daber Davar, which is a very inclusive pasuk that includes pasuk in Yeshaya, where we learn a lot of different extra Yisurim that are not included in the Lamatas Malachas come from this pasuk. He says Shabbos it certainly isn't. Mele, he says L'daiti, it could even be Asar Nisa Deraisa, but it's a very fascinating angle to come from. Like, you can't feel Shabbosdik over there. You're bumping around in a train. That's not Shabbosdik. Now, other poskim after the Chasam Sofer were more makel. Some Sfardi poskim, I think maybe Rav Abdallah Somech, who's the Zivchei Tzedek, is Rav Abdallah Somech, Baghdadi posik. I think Rav Adi might even have overlapped with him a tiny bit. He died like in the 1930s, and the Mishpat Uziel from Sim Chai Uziel, one of the first chief rabbis of Israel, the Sfardi chief rabbis. So they were more makel. They said that as long as you're not it's not operated by a Jew, and it's not going out of Tchumen, and there's no muktzah involved, then they don't see why there should be a problem to travel on a train. Says if it's in a very Yiddish area where there could be like you're staring Shabbos, then maybe not. But if you're traveling through Vienna and you want to go from one side to the other, that wouldn't be a problem. Now, the Gedolei HaPoskim from where we stam, from Europe, did not feel the same way. So the Gedolei HaPoskim, Rabbi Yosef Shaul and the Beis Yitzchak, Rabbi Yitzchak Shmelkish, both very strongly paskin that traveling on a train is Asar on Shabbos, for none other than the reason of Ovdun D'Chol and Zilusa the Shabbat. They felt that allowing people to travel on a train on Shabbos would be a tremendous pirza in Shabbos and would be a problem. For the Rebbe Shlomo writes, for example, no one will know what it means to have Shabbos. Meaning, if we're just going to allow regular transportation, travel around the town on a train on Shabbos, nobody's going to know. He says, Ki lo yishbos ha-mischar for Shabbos. Business won't end on Shabbos. They'll just use Shabbos to be the travel time. Like if I need to go to the market over here, so I know that Erev Shabbos at time I could get on the train, I'll be there by Mitzvah Shabbos, and business continues. He says, says from this it's going to come, they'll just be matir every Melech Shabbos. This ain't l'davar seif. I cannot allow this. Rabbi Yitzchak Shmelkish in his tshuva, he writes very similarly that he says Rabbi Yitzchak Shmelkish holds, he says Heshavti the asur mishum electricity. He says even if electricity is not asur, even if you're not being given electricity over here, it's zichur ovdin d'chayil, and etc. etc. So these gedolei paiskim all held that the travel on a train was Yilusa the Shabbat, was Ovdin D'Chayil. It's not allowed. It breaks down the parameters of Shabbos. Now, I found when I was looking through the train part in the Chalkas Yaakov that has a tshuva about trains, something very interesting that ties it to what we're talking about today. The Chalkas Yaakov in his tshuva about trains, he writes, I don't know where it is here, but he writes as follows. He brings down the Beis Yitzchak and the Sheila Meshiv that say that trains are also because the Ovdin D'Chayil is Yilusa the Shabbat. And his tshuva is about elevators, the Chalkas Yaakov. So Chalkas Yaakov is writing a tshuva in the 50s or the 60s about Shabbos elevators, a primitive form of Shabbos elevator. And he writes over there that Kayidur, the Rabbi Yosef Shaul, and the Beis Yitzchak, Paskin, that traveling on a train on Shabbos is also Tzilus Shabbat and Ovdin D'Chayil. He says in Mali, if it's a vertical travel or it's horizontal travel. He says an elevator is a train. Chalkas Yaakov says an elevator is mamash a train. It's the same thing. Mali, if I travel in this direction, I travel in this direction. Either way, I'm using some sort of electronic contraption, even though, granted, I'm not putting in malacha myself, to get me places where I can't get on a Shabbos on my own. So, Mali, if I go this way, I go this way. It's the same Zilus of the Shabbat, it's the same Ovdin D'Chayil, and Meli holds its asr. Now, what do you say?
Close to that boat, and there's a train.
Close to the boat. Yeah. So, now to wrap up the how extreme this is, in Reb Nissen Krell, it's a sefer on Chashmal. He brings, in the footnotes, they bring a psak from Shlomo Vosner, that when they were building the hospital, Ma'anei Yeshuos, in Bnei Brak, I guess, I don't know when that is exactly, they were building a new building, it was a tall building, and they wanted to put a Shabbos elevator, and they came to Reb Vosner to ask him if it's mutter or not. Reb Vosner told them that, no, put a regular elevator. Anybody who's allowed to use an elevator, it's pekuach nefesh, it's a hospital, use a regular elevator. If you're not allowed to use an elevator, you're also not allowed to use a Shabbos elevator. Rav Vosner held that the Zilusa the Shabbat, it's better to use a regular elevator when it's mutter than to use a Shabbos elevator. He says you're not mitigating the Yisurim, you're adding more Yisurim. Someone who's pekuach nefesh, so good. So use an elevator. You're allowed to use an elevator with pekuach nefesh. You tell me you're mitigating it by giving them a Shabbos elevator, you're not mitigating it. You're creating more Zilusa the Shabbat of everybody else. So the Ma'anei Yeshua's hospital, I think till today, does not have Shabbos elevators. They have regular elevators. If you're there for pekuach nefesh cause, knock yourself out. If you're there for not, the steps. That's how Ma'anei Yeshua is based on Rav Vosner's psak is I think still operating till today. So b'cholif, and I'm just showing that there's a lot of background and source to show that Zilusa the Shabbat is a relevant reason to create a psak, even if something would normally not be aser. Now I'll just say one more thing. I think with this I'll end. There's a famous shayla about using umbrellas on Shabbos, right? And Yehuda famously in a tshuva. In the Archaim Kama Tshuva Lamed, and Yehuda writes that it's Asa Deiraisa Al Tzbeina. Some Sefer in Tshuva Ein Aleph in Archaim writes that he doesn't see why the Ned Yehuda holds Asa Deiraisa. Maybe it's the Rabbanon, but he doesn't see the Ned Yehuda Zisser. L'maisa, we all know that it caught on in our circles not to use a umbrella on Shabbos because anything the Ned Yehuda said is a Deiraisa. Paiskim were afraid, even if they held it wasn't Mamash Deiraisa. If the Ned Yehuda says it's Deiraisa, you go easy on it. You're not going to be mekel b'shufi to use an umbrella. Now, the Chazon Ish, who strongly disagrees with this Ned Yehuda, the Chazon Ish in our Chaim Siman Nun Beis, strongly disagrees with this Ned Yehuda. He holds that the Ned Yehuda is taking it too far, and he writes as follows. He says, Kivan shu guf echad, an umbrella is one thing, v'chein derech tashmishay, that's the way to use it, ein kan oil, it's not an oil, etc., etc. Fine. It's not taken mana. He says, v'gam av shemilsa tvei, it's not a problem. He says, v'nik, so then the Chazon Ish says, as follows. He says, but Lamaisa, it's nicker by Uvda Dechayl. It seems like it's Uvda Dechayl to use it. V'gayrim Pirza, it causes a Pirza in Hilchas Shabbos. And this is the punchline. He says, V'harei hadavar masar l'chachamim. He's referring to the Neid Yehuda. Even though the Neid Yehuda I hold was wrong, Kilu, in what he said it's Asar out, it says, Harei hadavar masar l'chachamim, ligder geder b'makom ha'pirza. It's the davar is masar l'chachmei hadar, to be geder a pirza, and to know when to put their foot down and when to say, no, this is Yilus of the Shabbat. V'zeh yoyser chamim v'yeser prati liyachid. This is much more chamer than an Isser Prati for one Yachid. When a Chacham, like the Neid Yehuda says, that it's Asr because I think this is the Yilus of the Shabbat, this is a Pirza. Which the Neid Yehuda strongly felt this was a Pirza in Hilchos Shabbos. He writes it in his Shuvas and he revisited it in Drashas Hatzlach. One year in Shuva for Shabbos Shuva, the Chilul Shabbos that he addressed to the Kila where they need Chizik is in umbrellas. Like he definitely felt there was a Pirza in Shmir Shabbos. He says, Hadavar Masar l'chachamim is a Yoser Chamim Yeser Prati l'Yachid ki ze geder la'am kulei u'ledeiris. When someone like the Neid Yehuda or someone like Rav Vazna or whatever makes a geder and they say, or Yashiv, Chaim Kanievsky, whoever signed them that letter and says that something's asr, it's Yilus of the Shabbat, it's the Pirza Shabbat, he says that's much more chamer, the Chazon Ish says, than a regular psak. A regular psak is a halacha psak. You chaylik, you like it, you don't like it. He says this is something that's a geder la'am kulei l'deiris. So, I don't know if you could say that, when something was nispashit, and when the het of Reb Shlomo Zalman was certainly nispashit, and in other places they're make like it, and it's hard to say that there was like a hachra l'deiris, that it's us to use Shabbos elevators. L'chayra in Bnei Brak, there was some sort of hachra like that seems to be holding up, that you don't use Shabbos elevators. But other places, it's hard to know if this is hachra la'amul l'deiris, like the Chazon Ish says. But like the idea that a psak that comes Mishum Zilus of the Shabbat, Mishum Uvdin Dechayl, has an incredible chaymer, possibly even more than the regular chaymer of psak in Hilchos Shabbos, we certainly find. Now, there's a lot of similar psak territory that's relevant to America. America, keeping Shabbos in America in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, before Shabbos was mamish, ensconced. Reb Moshe is full of these type of gedarim mishum Hilchos Shabbos. I think maybe potentially we'll continue that next week. Maybe Reb Moshe's Shabbos in America. Maybe Shabbos in America.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.